Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this illuminating conversation about voting rights of Native Americans and Alaska Natives, our country's first Americans. Mpetu Washte, Han Mitakuape. I'm Patrice Kunesh. I'm the Major Gifts Officer at the Native American Rights Fund, where I started my legal career many years ago. I am really excited to moderate this conversation, a first of its kind for the Native American Rights Fund. And how appropriate that we're having this conversation on National Voter Registration Day. For 50 years, NARF has provided legal assistance to Native American tribes, organizations, and individuals nationwide. And we've achieved significant results in areas such as tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, natural resource protection, and voting rights, today's topic of discussion. And in the midst of a national reckoning over voting this year, the complicated localized policies of how people actually vote need a lot more attention than ever. In Indian country, this means illuminating the persistent obstacles that Native people face at every turn in trying to access the political process. For example, a staggering 1.5 million eligible Native voters are not yet registered to vote. And even more startling is the inaccessibility of the ballot box to so many registered Native voters. Two intrepid Native NARF attorneys, Natalie Landreth and Jaqueline De León, have spent several years investigating these crushing issues. Their findings of pervasive voting inequities in tribal communities throughout the country are collected into a report released this summer, along with tactical strategies to help Native people claim their political power. I included a link to this report in the invite, and it's also posted on our line. On our webpage. So I do hope you have a chance to take a look at it. Now I'd like to welcome my colleagues, legal experts, Natalie Landreth and Jaqueline De León. Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us today. Jacqueline is an enrolled member of the Isleta Pueblo. She led the field hearings across Indian country on Native voting rights, and she's extensively involved in voter rights litigation. Jacqueline holds a JD from Stanford and a BA in philosophy from Princeton University. She clerked on both the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey and for Chief Justice Dana Fabe of the Alaska Supreme Court. Thank you, Jacqueline. And Natalie is a senior NARF attorney in our Anchorage office. She's a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She practices on a wide variety of federal Indian law issues, including, of course, voting rights, election law, Indian child welfare, cultural protection, and a whole lot more. She's been instrumental in establishing key voting protections in Alaska, and she's testified before Congress in support of renewing the Voting Rights Act. Natalie is a graduate of Harvard University and Harvard Law School, and she also clerked for the Honorable Dana Fabe of the Alaska Supreme Court. Both Jacqueline and Natalie are my real life heroes. So as to the format of this conversation, I'll start off with some fundamental or foundational questions about voting rights. We'd love to hear from the attendees. So please, in the Q&A box, don't hesitate to ask a question, and we'll field it to Natalie and Jacqueline. We would really like this to be as much of a conversation as possible. So let's get started. And Jacqueline, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like you to talk about the origins of voting rights. For example, we've heard a lot about the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the culmination of women's suffrage movement. But for Native people, we're not even considered citizens. We were not even considered citizens of the United States until 1924. And even then, we couldn't really be guaranteed of our right to vote for more than 40 years in the Voting Rights Act. So how is it, Jacqueline, that our first Americans were the last to secure the right to vote?
Well, first, thanks so much, Patrice, for putting this all together. We're just excited to talk about voting rights, and obviously, Native Americans across this country deserve to have their voices heard in the upcoming election. And so, it's really critical that we think about all of the barriers. And so we're excited to have this conversation. Historically, I think that it's been a long road to enfranchisement, and it's obviously still ongoing, but I think there's some key things to think about when we think about the past. So like you mentioned, Native Americans were conferred citizenship in 1924. And so really that was the first opportunity for Native Americans to begin to vote. But states still were fearful of the power that potentially Native Americans could bring given their significant populations. And so states enacted a slew of laws that were meant to disenfranchise Native Americans. And North Dakota's Constitution, for example, had a provision that required that you be civilized in order to participate, right? And so states often had these types of clauses that would require tribal members to renounce, their tribal ways in order to participate. And that, I think, that idea that the American participation, American democracy is somehow in conflict with tribal sovereignty is this propaganda that was created by states to disenfranchise Native Americans and keep them from seizing their political power. And we saw, even more insulting stances taken by states. For example, in New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, those states would argue that Native Americans were incompetent because of the way that the federal system is composed. So in the Marshall Trilogy, there was this idea that Native Americans are wards and the federal government is the guardian. And states took that language and rather perversely made it so that Native Americans said that, well, because you are a ward, you are therefore incompetent to vote. And this kind of insulting construct really played itself out in people's voting experiences. So Native Americans would go to the polls and the poll worker would say, you're incompetent to vote, and so you cannot vote. And obviously this is a person of intelligence that's involved in trying to wield their political power. And really this wasn't resolved until Native Americans that went away for war came back and said, hey, I'm competent enough to fight on behalf of this country. That also means that I'm competent enough to cast my ballot. And what we saw there is, the states continued their legal arguments. They lost in their state Supreme Courts. And shortly, this was all the way in the late 40s, early 50s. And then with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act is when Native Americans were fully enfranchised, because states still had literacy tests that Native Americans couldn't pass and other competency tests that Native Americans couldn't pass. So it's been a long road, a road dotted with propaganda, and we see the consequences of that framing even today.
Well, thank you for that background. I knew some of it, but certainly not all of it or the extensiveness of it. And obviously, we're still suffering the consequences of a lot of that.
And I'll say, because it wasn't so long ago, we still have elders, right, that will pass along the message that participation in the American system means it's a betrayal of your Indian ways. And that's because that's was literally their experience, right? It's not
Yes.
an irrational, stance for them to take, because they were victims of this propaganda. So,
Oh, that,
you know,
that history is so, so incredibly important.
and
Absolutely.
yeah.
Oh, well, Natalie, I love your earrings, by the way. Just stunning. Yes. Um, you've been working on voting rights, Native voting rights on many fronts, from litigation to coalition building. To start well with, I'm curious, how did you get involved in this work?
Thank you. And thank you, Patrice, for coming up with this idea, sharing all this information. Thank you to Mata and Murray for organizing the technical aspects. I should probably answer your question first. My earrings are by on the website B Yellowtail, who's a Native artist that provides a platform also for other Native artists, and she's wonderful. And she recently had a message to share about voting as well. So that's why I wore these today specifically, out of
Voting
respect for her
earrings.
message. That's right. So how did we get started? It's a pretty funny story, actually, and I'll tell you the abbreviated version. We were asked in 2005, we were asked, hey, has NARF ever worked on voting rights? Because the Voting Rights Act is up for reauthorization in 2006. And we're not so sure it's ever really been implemented in Alaska. And I said, okay, well, just whatever, send it to me, I'll figure it out, but I've never read the Voting Rights Act. I read it. I wrote a report with a wonderful woman named Moira Smith, who I believe was in law school at the time or a law clerk, and so took on double duty. And we submitted this report to Congress in 2006 showing that Alaska had never complied with the Voting Rights Act ever in 35 years, specifically Section 203, which is the section of the act that provides you have to translate election materials, which is everything that you see about an election, unless it's created by a candidate. So, you know, date, time, place of the election, ballot measures, everything is supposed to be translated, and they had never done that. And I was greeted with a congressional subpoena one Monday morning on my chair. And I didn't even own a suit at the time. So, and it takes 12 hours to get from Alaska to DC. So I had to leave Monday afternoon for a Wednesday hearing. If I would have left Tuesday, you risk not getting there in time if you miss even one connection. So I bought a suit on the way to the airport, put it in with its tags on, and then went and testified in favor of the Voting Rights Act's renewal based on the absolutely astounding information we had learned about Alaska. And that began a lot of our work. And then we expanded significantly in 2015 from, instead of just litigating, which is incredibly important because it's how you affect social change with people who don't want to give you power, we expanded it into creating a whole coalition for Native American voting rights, which we currently lead. And I can't take credit for that idea. That idea actually came from of our grantors and funders who said, you'll be more effective if you pair up with others. And that's exactly what we did. So we gathered voting rights litigators, advocates, some tribal leaders, all in one meeting. And now we are at our 5th year anniversary of working through that project.
So if you were to accomplish everything that the coalition is looking for, and it's, I think, really ambitious goals, what would success look like in Indian country?
Right. So we tell people, you know, in terms of what are the goals of the coalition, and I think they expect these goals look like how you would write them in a grant or something. But no, the answer is very simple. Political power in Indian communities. They're entitled to the power that their populations hold. And that's what we're really after, is giving a voice to a lot of these communities. And how do you do that? Well, there's a couple specific steps. This is what we want it to look like. Every tribe has a polling place where they need them, and one or more on every reservation, certainly. Those polling places are open at the same time as polling places off reservation. Everybody can easily register and is actually able to vote. Voter turnout is high because it's now accessible and voters have confidence that their ballot will be counted. Because turnout is good, tribal members are actually able to elect people that represent their views. And by doing that, those representatives pass or support laws that benefit those tribal members. Those are the steps, and that's the overall vision.
Wow. That would be so ultimately fabulous. I know there are several Native candidates at all levels of government running this year, and it's so inspiring to see that level of participation in the general process. So Natalie, I'm going to Jacqueline, I'm going to come back to you and ask you something that you had mentioned earlier, and that was about in-person voting versus mail-in voting. And I think you have a strong preference for in-person voting and would be hesitant to endorse mail-in voting as an overall process for Indian country. Can you tell us about that tension and why one or the other, or maybe both?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a both, right? Like, to the extent that somebody can vote by mail, I think they certainly should have that option. And, I think that they should exercise, voting in any way that's possible. But I can talk a little bit about why that's really difficult to do in Indian country. And the problem that we see time and time again is this kind of hard shift, especially given COVID-19, this hard shift to vote by mail, and this belief, sometimes with allies and in the progressive community, that vote by mail is going to increase turnout. But the truth is that in Native American communities, it's just hard. And probably the best way to think about this is to realize as the first step that Native Americans often on reservations aren't receiving mail service, meaning they're not going to get their ballot at their door, and they're not going to be able to mail it at their door. So already, in this time of COVID-19, right, there's not this safe option of getting your ballot delivered to your door. You're going to have to go out. And where do they go? They often have to go to a distant post office, a post office that is 20, 40 miles away in a border town. And then, that post office is likely going to be a rural post office, which means that it's only going to be open very limited hours. It's going to be open Tuesdays and Thursdays from, 12 to 4 or something like that, because it's this rural post office. Often Native Americans are sharing a P.O. box in order to get their mail. P.O. boxes usually have fees associated with them. They're limited in number, which means that people are going to go to make this really long trek, pick up the mail for everybody that they can at the post office, bring it back to the reservation, and pass it out when they can. This is obviously, a system that's the best that Native Americans are making do with what they have to on Native reservations, and it's critical that they be able to pick up mail for each other. But the bottom line is that it's just a hard system to vote by mail. So imagine, you're going to this distant post office, you're picking up your ballot, you're traveling all the way back home, you're filling out your ballot, you're making the trek back to the post office to drop it off, right? Well, then your mail is coming from a rural post office. So it is going to have to travel, and what is often weird and circuitous routes, meaning that, for example, a voter from the Walker River tribe in Nevada will drop their ballot off at their local post office. It's going to bump down 90 miles to Reno before it bumps back up to Hawthorne, where the county seat is. And that county seat only originally was 40 miles away from the reservation, but it makes this long loop before it finally gets there, which means that all this time is going to be added to the mail, all this unpredictability, these additional touch points of sorting mail and getting mail and more opportunity for it to get lost. All of that happens from the post offices that Native Americans have to use. And so, there's just a lot of opportunity for error and a lot of opportunity for ballots to be missed. And in fact, in the recent primary in North Dakota that shifted to all vote by mail, 270 of the 2,800 eligible people ultimately were able to cast their ballot. And that, is, I think, 9% of.
Oh, say those numbers again, Jacqueline?
270 people out of 2,800 eligible voters were able to cast their ballot at a rate of 9%. And that obviously is just a dismal, primaries have lower turnouts to begin with. 9% is not acceptable by any measure.
Oh my goodness. Say, you spoke of Nevada, and there was a recent federal district court decision out of Nevada concerning collection of ballots. Jacqueline or Natalie, we were involved in that case. NARF was involved in that case, right?
Yeah, so we moved to intervene in that case because it really had tribal interests that were at stake. And what happened is that in that instance, the Donald Trump campaign and the Republican National Party brought suit against Nevada, which had a emergency legislation. And what the emergency legislation did was it stopped Nevada's ballot collection ban. So ballot collection bans are these laws. I think sometimes some people call it ballot harvesting, right? And that are supposed to keep people from picking up and dropping off mail for each other. The idea
is
that
you were talking about,
exactly.
Yes, with the shared PO box, yes.
Exactly. But now if you think about Indian country, right, it's not some elaborate scheme to defraud, the ballots. It's called picking up mail, right? There's no, it's just a way of life. And so because it's so, and it has a lot of costs associated with it, a tank of gas, time.
I was just thinking of that, absolutely.
Have a working vehicle. All of those things cost time and money. And so people, in order to reduce those costs, pull their resources together and pick up and drop off mail for each other. So, when they sued to keep that ballot collection ban from going, from being enforced, we intervened there. And we were happy to see that the court dismissed the claim. And so ballot collection will be in effect.
And that's important to the Native communities in Nevada, maybe even rural communities.
Absolutely, yeah.
Throughout the state. I think Nevada is the most rural state in the union. My days of rural development, I remember that little factoid. So
yeah, and I want to just thank the Walker River Paiute tribe and the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe for standing up for their rights in Nevada.
Fantastic. Hey, Natalie, I'm going to go back to you, and you've, in addition to voting rights, I know you've been very involved with the census issues, and the census issues obviously to districting or redistricting that come off of the decennial census. So you've recently launched a redistricting project here at the Native American Rights Fund, calling it a first of its kind as well, a transformational effort along with everything else that you and Jacqueline are doing. Can you tell us how voting rights and redistricting intersect?
Sure. And I'll just give 2 words about the census because we're involved in the census because of redistricting and voting rights, and they're related. So if I can explain briefly, the coalition that we talked about earlier, the Native American Voting Rights Coalition that started in 2015, has a strategic plan. It has like a 10-year plan for all the things that it wanted to do. And the series of field hearings that Jacqueline led and wrote the report on is one of those key features. And another feature of that is that we wanted to become heavily involved in the census for the first time because we want good numbers. We want good numbers for redistricting. But also, I think it's important for people that might be watching this or watch it later to understand this one simple fact. Every single person that does not answer the census costs their community $3,200 per year for the next 10 years. And there are currently almost 1 million uncounted Indians in the United States. And that's over that 10-year period, over $8 billion lost to Native communities by not being counted. So that's the simple fact about how important the census is, because so many federal dollars, everything from your roads to any sort of social welfare programs to the costs that go to your schools, all of that is based on census numbers. But we were in it originally, in addition to caring for our clients and the communities they come from, is we want really good response rates so we can get good numbers. And by that, I mean, we need people to respond so we can help them with redistricting. And if I can explain sort of how that's related, if you want to pull up the slide that I sent so people can see what I'm talking about, because for some folks, redistricting might be a new thing for you. Okay, so this is, and I'm going to explain to you, I'm going to answer Patrice's question by showing you this picture here, okay? So we've removed the red and blue so people can look at them as purple and gray. And so on the left, let's say this is a Native community. Let's say it's 60% purple and 40% gray. So the 40% will be Natives and the 40% are non-Indians. And let's say they don't vote the same, because the Native American community there may have different interests than the non-Natives. That is an extremely common fact pattern. Here's the redistricting in action. The black lines represent when you cut them into maybe city council seats or congressional seats. If you're looking at a much larger population group, you would be looking, the way they were cut up this way with these black lines results in 3 purple districts and 0 gray, okay? Same population. Third option, if you do it this way, you get, even though they're a majority, 1 purple district and 2 gray districts. This third option is gerrymandering. And this is what is happening to a lot of Native communities. So we were looking to get on the front end, the 60% purple wards and the 40% gray, or whatever percentage it is for the Native Americans. We want as accurate a count as we can get before we emerge to deal with pictures 2 and 3. And right now, unfortunately, this majority population with only 1 out of 3 districts that you see on the far right slide is common in Indian country. And it's called cracking, or in certain circumstances, packing. But cracking means you've taken 1 district of people who have a lot in common and who will vote the same, and in order to dilute their political power, you're going to cut them into a district where you minimize their power. That's what gerrymandering is. And it comes from the election of 1812. Elbridge Gerry made a district that looked like a salamander. So if you've ever wondered where gerrymander comes from, it's those 2 words. But so this is what's happening. And it's very real, and it happens in red states and blue states and all over the place, where Indian reservations and communities, even if not a federal reservation, are broken up to sort of annex their population to other districts. And what happens? You're a permanent numerical minority. And even though there are enough of you, you can never elect somebody who represents your interests. And that is redistricting and gerrymandering in a nutshell.
So what would a district with fair representation look like in Indian country of these 3 slides?
Right. So there's a couple different ways that you can do them, where you'll have, a lot of, and each state has different criteria. But what we're looking at doing this time was, for the first time, instead of just litigating a lot of these redistricting cases after the fact, and a lot of them make their way to us after the damage has been done. A bad map has been adopted. A reservation finds itself in 3 different districts. And so suddenly nobody cares about their opinion because none of those politicians are now interested in them because they don't hold enough votes in that community. So we decided this time on the front end to help tribes, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to make sure we have enough trained attorneys who work in Indian country who also understand redistricting. And to do that, we're going to have like a trial level training for folks to do this. Also, training tribes. Here's why this is important. Do you ever feel like you're going to vote and nothing ever changes? Have you ever looked at the district that you're in? because that may be why. And what we've decided to do this time was to train an attorney corps, like an army of lawyers in Indian country, train the tribes about creating their own maps, advocating for their own maps, trying to get the best districts they can, and then defending them in court if need be. So we've got this really lengthy, 4 to 5 year process set out that we've never done before. But I want to give you one example about why this is so important. In District 3 here, the 1 purple district, 2 gray, let's look at this for a minute. 60% of that Indian community, 60% of that community might be Native. And they're never going to be able to elect someone who represents their views. They were a majority turned into a numerical minority. And the end result is your voter turnout can be 100%, and you still won't win. You still will not get your candidate elected. And a good example of this is North Dakota. Some of those districts saw voter turnout increase of 50 and 60%, and they still couldn't get beyond a certain number of seats. And it's because their communities are cracked into different districts. So it is the origin of the removal of a lot of political power from Native American communities.
Speaking of North Dakota, and my family's from North Dakota as well as South Dakota. I think it was last election where the state enacted a law that said voters had to have a physical address associated with their house. And you had explained earlier, Jacqueline, that we have mostly PO boxes. And it created a lot of chaos and confusion about, well, what do we do if we don't have a physical address? Was it the BIA that it gives out addresses? How did that work? How did that resolve itself?
Yeah, so I think it's actually really an interesting thing to look at closely is North Dakota, because it's important to remember that NARF was in North Dakota, suing North Dakota since 2016, had been laying the groundwork for that lawsuit since 2014, right? So 2014 is when we started hearing that Native Americans were being disenfranchised. And the reason that they were being disenfranchised is because Heidi Heitkamp, a Democrat, had won the election in 2012, and she won by 1% of the vote, right? And everybody attributed that win to the Native American vote. And it was like this moment where everybody was like, natives did it. The very next legislative session, the legislature enacted a law that required that everybody have an ID with a residential street address on it.
Yes.
The legislative session immediately prior to Heidi Heitkamp's election in 2011 had contemplated a similar law and rejected it because they had been told, in part, Native Americans don't have residential street addresses. So they were well aware of what they were doing when they passed that law. And so predictably, right, so they passed this law in 2013, predictably in 2014, Native Americans go to vote, they've got their tribal IDs, no address on it, they're turned away, right? And that's when NARF got the call, and NARF started laying the groundwork for the lawsuit that they filed in 2016. And at the time, it was a full-on effort, and we had been doing some good wins there in the district court where even a Republican appointed judge, right? So in a bunch of different, a very conservative court generally recognized that this was a blatantly unfair rule, right? That to require an address when somebody doesn't have an address is going to disenfranchise them. And so, we received, NARF won a preliminary injunction. I wasn't part of the team then. It was led by Matthew Campbell, who did a great job leading that effort. And then in 2017, I joined the team because North Dakota passed another law, right, after the court had issued a preliminary injunction. And that law was exactly the same, right? It was intended to circumvent the preliminary injunction. And it did some other things, but it left intact the core piece of the disenfranchisement, which was requiring an address on an ID, right? You don't have an address, you can't vote. And so we sued again. And then in 2018, Heidi Heitkamp was up for re-election. There was a moment of intense attention based on the fact that, oh my gosh, you know, the Senate is up for grabs and here's this endangered person. And so suddenly there was all this attention on this issue. These are the types of cases that NARF is litigating across the country right now with equally horrific fact patterns. And, you know, we were fortunate to have that moment where there was a ton of scrutiny and we were able to say, you know, we've been litigating this case for 4 years. And, you know, obviously this is egregious and outrageous. And, you know, the fact that, you know, somebody is so blatantly trying to disenfranchise Native Americans is wrong, especially in light of the fact that they did it immediately when the Native Americans flexed their political power. But, you know, we're currently involved in a lot of lawsuits with those same type of egregious fact patterns. Ultimately, we were able to reach a settlement with the state. Given the intense scrutiny, we won. They appealed to the 8th Circuit. We ended up reaching a settlement where Native Americans can use their IDs, where the state is obligated to issue free IDs, and where if they're missing an ID, the state an address, the state must assign an address to that voter before the ballots are counted. So nobody should be disenfranchised.
Wow. Say, I want to go to the question from an attendee, and Larry Davis is asking, logistically, is voting by mail more problematic west of the Mississippi or east of the Mississippi for Native voters?
I would say that you're going to have longer distances possibly west of the Mississippi, but we've been hearing evidence that this is also a problem in parts of rural North Carolina, as well as rural Mississippi for the Mississippi Choctaw. So I don't think it's purely a Western problem. There are larger reservations and longer distances, but I think this is something that they share. But Jacqueline will probably know more about this as working on a comprehensive addressing program. So what do you think, Jacqueline?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you're right that the distance becomes more of an issue the west, more west you go, but not having an address is not having an address, and not getting mail delivery is not getting mail delivery. And so, it's hard to vote. Yes, it's additionally hard when you got to travel 40 miles, but it's hard to go into a post office to get your mail, even if it's 4 miles, even if it's in the same town as you are, especially during COVID, and especially, when people require resources. 4 miles in November, you're not going to drive that distance. You still need a working car, even if it's 4 miles. You still need some gas and time. So those are really problematic barriers.
All right, east-west. How about urban-rural? Are we seeing urban voting issues? An undercount, Natalie, perhaps in the census?
So we're having different issues in terms of urban versus rural, and because they're differently, have different access to services, their issues can be very different. I do think one thing that people need to take into account, urban versus rural as well, but more pronounced in rural communities because of the transportation and distance issues, is that Jacqueline and I just finished a trial like this, by the way. The first trial we've had to do on Zoom, which you've never seen one, is really preferable to being in a courtroom, because I was able to turn off the camera and go get a coffee at any time, which you cannot do if you're sitting in a 64-degree courtroom for 8 hours a day. But anyway.
No, was that in Montana?
That was the Montana ballot collection case, which we're currently awaiting a decision on. The testimony there was that the poverty rate was 48.2% on one of the client's reservations that we were talking about. So you have to consider that although some people may look at 4 miles, like Jacqueline mentioned, or look at shorter distances for urban areas and others, and places, east of the Mississippi, if you don't have a car, you still aren't getting there. And you have to look at the poverty rates of a lot of these communities. And unfortunately, a lot of our communities do have very high poverty rates and can't do that. They just can't do that. They'll be sharing a car in one entire household, which in some places might have up to 10 and 12 people because you have the aunties and cousins and everybody. And so I don't know if you came up with this term, Jacqueline, in the report, it's called the tyranny of distance, that in order to suppress the Indian vote, all you have to do is to make it a little far away, just make it a little far. You don't even need to go into the full PO box voter ID, just make it a little bit far, and they're not going to be able to make it there. And it's an active voter suppression tactic that we see manifest in prohibiting ballot collection, not providing enough ballot drop boxes, not providing polling places on reservations. So yeah.
This has been so terrific, and I appreciate the comments from our attendees sharing that this is an important conversation and we need this kind of a call every month. So I really appreciate this really in-depth, rich conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's been a really chaotic time, and the impact of the sadness of her death is very palpable, and many people are leaping to the impact of her loss to the Supreme Court. And I just wanted to have your thoughts and reflections on the impact that she had, both on voting rights, because she was certainly a champion of voting rights and women's rights, and then her work and role in Indian law. She, like many other Supreme Court justices, are unfamiliar with federal Indian law and tended to seek parallels in areas of law and models of analysis that were more familiar to them, but didn't align with the principles of federal Indian law. And it resulted in some incoherent results. I think that's fair to say. So I do think, though, that she evolved, and her comprehension of Indian law and the lived experience of Native people and tribal sovereignty evolved over time. So Natalie, let's start with you, and can you share a few thoughts about Ginsburg's impact in maybe the Supreme Court or federal Indian law?
Mm-hmm. So I think the main issue with her passing for my work personally and my work here at NARF is the impact on voting rights. This is someone who really understood voting barriers. We were just talking about distance and transportation and poverty and access, and this is someone who got those barriers. And she had a different record in Indian law. I think it took her a little bit longer to understand some of that. And I think that's due to some folks who come from the civil rights community, and she was an ACLU lawyer. Some people who come from the civil rights community are very focused on inclusion, equal protection, and a sense of equality, and a paradigm that doesn't necessarily fit neatly with our Indian nation's notion of sovereignty and the separateness and the maintenance of our government's jurisdiction, culture, membership, and that we're not social groups, we're governments. And so those two things didn't always align, and I think that's the origin of some of her different opinions that may not have been supportive. But Brennan was the same way. Wrote some decisions like Ling that will forever haunt us, but excellent on voting rights, right? So I think that's the concern, is that as Jacqueline and I litigate these cases, and we're litigating right now 6 active cases just in voting, and that's the most we've ever done at one time for a staff of 18 lawyers, 6 voting cases at one time, probably soon to be 7 or so, who knows, is that it has made it really uncertain for us to know whether we can count on the Supreme Court to get what we're saying, to really understand the voting barriers in Indian country, to really understand the nature of our cases and why things that may look innocuous are actually voter suppression, like just moving your polling place a little bit farther away. They need to understand the nature of how those barriers work and how they add up. And that's the concern when we look at it, is that her legacy, this was someone you could rely on to get the barriers. She said, I got it because I've been through the barriers. And now we're worried about whether or not the successor will understand those.
Jacqueline, I know you thought about this too, and you have some real sadness in your heart. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Natalie just really, I think she really covered it here. I think that the bottom line is that voting rights are in peril. The Voting Rights Act is in peril. We use Section 2 to bring many of our cases, and one of the key provisions of Section 2 is to say that it's not what's in the heart of the person that's necessarily making the laws, it's the result, right? So if the result is discrimination, then this is not a good law, right? A lot of people are gunning for that results test. Instead, they just want to say, well, it has to be this intentional discrimination. Somebody's got to prove that they have hate in their heart in order to protect, in order to say that this was a discriminatory law. And the result of that is just that it becomes an almost impossible burden to prove. But the fact patterns remain so poor in Indian country that we will still be bringing cases, even in the worst case scenarios, right? I think in North Dakota, we brought an intentional discrimination claim. In Arizona, their recent ballot collecting law was found to be intentionally discriminatory towards Native Americans, given their clear record there. But I think that with the loss of Justice Ginsburg, as Natalie said, we lost somebody who understood barriers, who understood that results are ultimately what matter. It doesn't matter if somebody has hate in their heart. What matters is that it's hard, unreasonably hard for people to vote. And so, it's gonna, I think, affect our work for a long time. And I think that's why we all grieved especially hard, on top of the fact that I think that as women, as lawyers, we appreciate her legacy of fairness and of perseverance through so much discrimination.
Wow, that's a heavy. That is not just a heavy heart, but sort of a heaviness in terms of the work that's ahead of us and how we need to be thoughtful and planful and certainly collaborate around this work. And NARF is supporting this work with a very sizable cadre of attorneys, which is really quite remarkable. And I just am so proud of all of this work. We have another question or comment from an attendee. Jennifer Heck, thank you so much for participating with us tonight. She said, what are some of the ways that she can help address these issues? As an ally and or a donor, I'd say both, but give us some good practical ways that people be in our sphere of partnership. How can they help us, help you, help Native people access the vote?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First, I want to, one of my voting rights colleagues here, Kim Gottschalk, if I can go off the rail for 1 second, corrected my math. And this is a reminder to all of you, don't ever let me do your taxes or balance your checkbook. He said doing the numbers of the census that I talked about didn't result in an $8 billion loss to Indian communities. It was over $30 billion over 10 years. So way off. But just so you're I just want to correct myself on the record, especially since this is being recorded and replayed. So ways that you can help. One of the things that's really important is that creating this Native American Voting Rights Coalition allows us to have a network of access. So it's going to depend on how you are situated. Are you a lawyer barred in a state that wants to join us on a case? Are you somebody that works at a foundation? Are you somebody that works in a particular state? So I think one of the things we are doing as a coalition, we are doing an internal election 2020 project focusing on some of the states where voter suppression is at its most aggressive right now. So that's me, Jacqueline, and our colleagues, Matt and Kim, who work here at NARF, and Sam and Dan Lovrins in our DC office, focusing on states where it's really intense, and it's because they're in what's considered a swing state. They're facing a lot of aggressive tactics right now, and that would be North Carolina, Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Arizona. And Jacqueline can correct me if I've got one or more of the states wrong.
Wisconsin and Michigan as well.
Oh
Right,
my
yeah.
gosh.
And Nevada.
Don't
Wow.
forget the hotbed of trouble, the sleeper hotbed of trouble known as Wisconsin. You won't believe the things Jacqueline found in her field hearing going on in Wisconsin. But in terms of being able to help, we are going to compile to post on NARF's website and send to our donors. If these things compel you to want to help, here are some of the different ways that you can do that. So we're going to follow up this conversation with more information depending on how you're situated. There may be ways that you can become more active. There may be ways that you can support in-state. There may be financial ways and places to support some of this work because, of course, so much, everything that we do has been supported through grants from foundations, organizations, and individuals who care about voting. So, and then Jacqueline may have more specific ideas than I do at this point. So I'd like to also.
So first, Patrice, I want to say thanks for saying that we're a big team. We are small but mighty. And often, I think that when we are, facing up against our pals in the civil rights community, I feel very small compared to how large they are.
The David and Goliath. Yeah.
Exactly. But, and so we certainly appreciate all the support that we can get. And I know that, as Natalie mentioned, in these next couple of months, it's really about figuring out what's going on in those key states so that we can, respond swiftly to the issues that arise on the ground. And the biggest thing that's happening right now, this second, is that the states are enacting kind of emergency protocol procedures in light of COVID, and they are getting rid of polling places and bullying tribes into accepting all vote by mail, right? So tribes that are overwhelmed by COVID are getting a request from their county that's saying to them, hey, obviously this virus is very dangerous. So we're going to get rid of your in-person polling place and we're going to mail everybody their ballot. So don't worry about it. That's going to be a great solution. Unfortunately, right, like we saw in North Dakota when they made that switch, that means that a bunch of people are going to just not going to get that ballot in the first place, right? They're just never going to receive the ballot. It's November 3rd, it's going to roll around. They're going to poke their head up and they're going to go down and they're going to realize there's no polling place. And so I think one of the biggest things that people can do is if you're living in a state, contact your states that have Native populations. Say, are you maintaining your in-person polling location? It's important to me that you maintain your in-person polling location on Native American lands, right? I know that, just letting them know that there's another person that's watching, because so much of what happens in Indian country happens in a vacuum, and so much is decided by one county official that is responsible for conducting their election. And what we saw in the field report hearing time and time again is that county official is often living in a border town that has a long history of racism against Native Americans. So that's when we see things like voting locations that are a chicken coop or inside. In Wisconsin, we saw a voting location that was a sheriff's office. We also saw these kind of overt tactics that are used to suppress the Native American vote because there's a hostility towards Native Americans. And so that external pressure, somebody else is watching, is important. So calling and saying, hey, you know, county in my state, I'm a resident of Michigan, and I noticed that, you know, I'm wondering if you're maintaining your in-person polling location in this county. I think that's important. Getting those kind of calls is, I think, you know, that external call is important to show that there are people out there watching. And funds, I think, can be spent locally as well, and in the ways Natalie said.
That's so fantastic. When I was teaching law at the University of South Dakota, I was amazed that the state removed the only voting place on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And it was just phenomenal because Pine Ridge is quite a large area, territory, and it literally would be hundreds of miles. And we do have a question from Jeff Schuman, and just a few minutes to ask, what possible justifications do states have for placing a polling, you know, place 280 miles away from live voters? I mean, is this a blatant political maneuver? Is sort of what I'm hearing and gathering. And it's been done all over, but it certainly doesn't seem right or fair or honorable, right?
That's right. I think what your instinct that this is a clear political maneuver is correct. This is what we see. We will see states say, well, it's too far for us to go. We have this fascinating circular argument in Nevada that they gave us where the tribe was 98 miles from their nearest polling place each way. Are you going to drive 98 miles to vote on a Tuesday if you're working, or even if you're not? No, you're not going to do that. Nobody's going to do that. And so the county told us there, we said, they're not going to drive 98 miles. This is, what's your possible justification for this in terms of the question? And I said, well, they have super low voter turnout. They don't need a polling place. And I said, did it occur to you that maybe voter turnout is low because it's 98 miles away?
What a circular, yeah, self-justified, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we saw that in Alaska. Those people aren't interested in voting. They don't need a polling place. It is another tool of voter suppression, and one that, you know, in our Supreme Court decision, our discussion is so important, is that county is not going to say it's intentional. They're going to come up with some other basis for it. It's budget related, usually too far for them to set up, not enough people. They're going to have another justification, right? And their justification is pretext, but we won't be able to meet an intentional discrimination standard for that. And that's why that ninth justice is so important.
Hey, going back to Justice Ginsburg, and I know we have a few minutes left, but Dan Whittemore asks a really interesting question. And he asks about Justice Ginsburg's decision citing Johnson versus McIntosh and affirming the doctrine of discovery. Is that something you're familiar with, either of you?
Sure. I mean, I think Justice Ginsburg's record towards Native Americans was mixed. And as Natalie explained, there was a history there that she had to learn. She had to get up to speed. And in the last 10 years, she really turned a corner and became, I think, a reliable, more reliable Native American advocate. But prior to that, I think that she did get a lot of things wrong.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I like leaving us on the thought of her work and her commitment to voting rights, which is something that all of us can appreciate and value, and know that that the work is so fundamental to our democracy. Well, our time has come to an end, and I just want to say that this has been a really necessary and urgent conversation, and given the backdrop of all the racial reckoning in the country, I just really appreciate your time, your effort. You've just come off of trial, and I know there's so much more to do. So I just really so much appreciate not only this conversation, but demonstrating how voting rights is such an essential part of good governance and good democracy and citizen participation across the board. And this being National Voter Registration Day, I hope all of us are really invigorated to support the Get Out the Vote efforts. So we've talked about how our attendees can help, the work that we're going to be doing in the next year. And it's just such an honor and privilege to be part of this team, of this mission, and going forward to protecting the rights of Native citizens. So a big Wopi Latanka, thank you very much, Natalie and Jacqueline. Your expertise and devotion to this work is just so commendable. Finally, I'd like to say a very sincere thank you to our production team. And Mata Moran is the producer of our program, first time for NARF, and I think we did an excellent job pulling it together and pulling it off. Marae Martinez and Nicole Keller, I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. So with that, I'd like to wish everyone be well and have a good evening.